Last year, the number of scripted TV series available in the United States on all viewing platforms hit a record 559, representing a 13% jump from 2020, according to research conducted by the cable network FX. That number only includes English language series and also doesn't account for the hundreds of movies that were released in theaters and on streaming services last year. During the pandemic, Americans' demand for new content became insatiable. The quandary for producers these days, though, is finding an available soundstage in which to make their product. They're available for developers and investors in building new ones and in readapting other spaces. Joining us today to talk about the dynamics of this soundstage phenomenon is Tima, a partner with Relativity Architects in Los Angeles, which has a history of soundstage design. Welcome, Tima.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
Tima, in 2020, there were about 12 million square feet of soundstage space in North America. Why wasn't that enough to meet production demand?
It's difficult when you assess America. American sound stages typically fluctuate according to local tax credits. For example, New Orleans had a multitude of sound stages, which are basically a wasteland now because they rescinded their tax credit. But in general, in answer sort of generalized your question, content grew. Netflix became the largest content creator in the world. Disney is right behind them. A bunch of new markets entered, Apple, Amazon Prime, and essentially every small channel from A&E, Bravo, all the way down and up started creating their own content. And in that content creation, stages or sound stages were needed. Normally, there'd be a cycling of shows through the sound stages, but compounding the space requirements, these larger content users or content creators like Netflix and Disney started snapping up sound stages for longer terms, thus also reducing the supply available.
Wow. So now Soundstage design represented about half of your work last year versus 10% pre-pandemic. Has your firm needed to make any changes internally to keep up with this subsector?
I want to clarify in saying that the 50% of work that we engage on sound stages since the pandemic is actually built work. Oh. We've been designing studios for 7 years. So it just what would happen is we'd get to the point of the level of commitment from capital, and they wouldn't feel comfortable with a single story building with a niche use. As the pandemic came into play and commercial construction for offices and creative space got diminished, they needed a place to put their money, and this all of a sudden became a lucrative investment. So in answer to your question, architecturally, we were prepared to actually move into construction of these designs because we have been designing studios for the last 7 years. Additionally, we have hired. I don't want to move on beyond that. I mean, to sort of diminish the fact that moving 50% of our work into studios hasn't required additional hiring for the office. It has. And, it has been interesting to teach certain project managers and professionals in our office about sound stages and bring in knowledgeable architects to kind of bolster our ability to create these as well.
Mm-hmm. Who generally is your client for this type of work? And have you found that the demand and building requirements differ by different markets?
Two questions. The first one, our clients run everything from the content creators themselves, although that is very rare. Normally, it is a developer or a management company who is interested in creating these stages. Sometimes it's the content creators, although they're normally the back-end user. So primarily, our clients are developers, East Coast and West Coast and international, as well as management companies. That one's primarily in Los Angeles, although we are working with some management companies overseas as well. The second question, I'm sorry, what was it again? The
Second question was, do you find that there are different requirements in different markets? For example, if you were to build in New York, would a soundstage requirement be different from what you might build in Georgia or Louisiana or Texas or?
Yeah. So the number one shifter in those is space. London and New York typically have less space. And so you're figuring out how to put things on top of stages or stages on top of other uses. It becomes a stacking element, which is totally a different way to design a stage than it is when you have the ground space to build a standalone unit. In Georgia, you have a little bit of different weather conditions. In Canada, you have huge different weather conditions. The cold weather requires a lot of interior uses that in Los Angeles would be considered exterior uses. Pretty much everything, including load-in Canada, is built inside. So you are creating almost a big covered shell to be able to encompass all the elements in the campus. And obviously in Los Angeles, space is a little harder to acquire, but what's key in Los Angeles is circulation and location. The closer you are to the talent and the executives involved, the more approachable your stage is going to be.
Tima, can you talk a little bit about some recent projects that your firm has engaged? Give me some flesh them out in terms of what they're.
Sure. So we've built the initial headquarters for BuzzFeed in Los Angeles that encompassed 12 smaller stages. We built Siren Studios, which is on Sunset Boulevard, now owned by Netflix, and I think they're converting it to animation. I'm not sure, but Siren Studios lasted for about 10 years as one of the state-of-the-art stages along Sunset Boulevard. We're currently in construction on 90,000 square feet in downtown LA in the Boyle Heights area. In addition, we're moving through the design permit process for 200,000 square feet, 120 a stage and 80 of office, also in the Boyle Heights area. And then I'm under NDA, so I can't talk very specifically, but we've got 3 campuses in Los Angeles ranging from 10 to 22 acres. And we are also have designed and are looking to construct a 9-acre campus in Winnipeg and a 20-acre campus in Atlanta.
No.
Oh, and Croatia and Prague, although we use different architects for those areas. So we're just the design architect and giving direction with consultation.
This trend has inevitably seen other AEC firms come into the market. In light of that dynamic, how does Relativity position itself when you're going after a particular job? I mean, what would you say are your distinguishing characteristics, to put it in?
No problem. Well, we've always there's a few elements to Relativity that makes this worthwhile for a client. First of all, it's a niche market. In Los Angeles, there's only 4 or 5 architects. Most New York architects are not interested in coming to Los Angeles to build because of the different typologies. Atlanta is also very insular. We've managed to extend ourselves beyond. Part of that is our experience grew from hospitality and affordable housing, and hospitality obviously engages a tenant in such a way that it's amenitized and circulated in a way that's really kind of engaging for a tenant. They feel good about where they are, and the affordable housing aspect gives us an understanding of durable but less expensive materials. That because these stages get used by multitudes of production companies, and they need to be able to survive. So a lot of times those 2 typologies come into play in making these things beautiful, functional, and solid built entities that have a great feel and space inside of them. Additionally, we are client service. We like to think of ourselves as client architects. You have to put aside ego in these cases. There's definitely a place for ego in lots of different types of architecture, but for studios, it's very much about the product as driven. Important to understand is that studios are essentially movie factories, and there's not a lot of creative sensibility of design for factories. They need to function first. That is the primary element of a factory. So within that, obviously, we can find really exciting ways to make the building special, whether it's glazing of the offices, screening. We've got some artists. We love to include art in our projects. So we've got giant murals going up on some of our projects that extend them beyond. But primarily our clients hire us because we are 100% committed to their projects. We are available and work with them to work through any sort of manipulation that's necessary in the industry. And we are extremely knowledgeable about the typology. And there aren't very many of us out there who are.
Soundstages service an industry that is more and more technologically driven. And I'm wondering if you see any trends out there that Soundstages are going to have to react to from a technology standpoint going forward.
Absolutely. The biggest one is the recent sort of, everyone calls it the Mandalorian type stage. It's commonly known as the XR or the AR stage. Basically, it's a 3-wall or 4-wall LED soundstage in which the LEDs act, for argument's sake, if you don't understand, similar to a green screen. Mm-hmm. They basically fill the backgrounds. Their energy requirements, their heating and cooling requirements, and their spatial requirements are entirely different than your set stage. And that has to be incorporated, or that will be incorporated in new stages consistently. Almost every campus we're working on is including up to at least 1, if not up to 5 of these stages to be involved. I think I read an article that this year, 128 stages are being used for XR and AR. It is really, wow, definitely the wave of the future. What's interesting to think about is that what's filmed on these XR and AR stages can be flipped into the metaverse with no problem. And you can shoot commercials in it. Everything that's filmed there is reusable to some extent. So for instance, if you do a sequel, you've got all of the backgrounds that you filmed the initial one in. You don't necessarily need to reshoot all of those backgrounds, go to those locations or build those sets because they're already been generated and rendered in your actual XR. So it's going to change the way movies are made. Probably not for another, the argument is 5. I'm probably going to say 10 because of the unions that are involved. But I think in about 10 years, we're going to see a pretty significant flip to this type of production.
Tima, you mentioned earlier that you do business in Canada, you do business in Eastern Europe, you do business in the United States. What's your prognosis, short and long term, for demand for Soundstages?
I get this question a lot. It's a great question. It's important to understand I'm an architect. So my view, I'm not involved with the project after it's completed. So the actual engagement with production companies and even the top end user into production is not really my realm. However, we do work quite a bit with management companies, and in discussions, we're probably realizing, I would estimate a 5-year bubble, but there's an important caveat to that. Content has to remain at this static level. So if content shifts and grows exponentially as it has, then the demand is going to grow. That's sort of the nature of the way it works. So I can say that if content were to remain where it is right now, or maybe a marginal increase, then we'd probably hit enough stages in about 5 years to encapsulate all of the demand. But at no time in my life has content remained static. Content has always grown from, my dad listening to the radio to, me watching a movie on my phone at this point, and I don't see it stopping. So it's sort of, it's both are growing exponentially, and I don't necessarily believe that content's going to stop growing. So it's a 2-part answer. I'm sorry if it's a little vague, but I believe that the need for stages will continue to grow as content grows.
Do you think that the centers for production that exist today, like LA, New York, London, will they remain the centers, or do you envision new cities emerging as film and TV production meccas?
They will remain the centers. There will always be alternative areas to film. Obviously, we've talked about Atlanta, Canada, Eastern Europe. Some of these places are inexpensive to shoot in. They offer fantastic tax credits, which is why people like to shoot in those spaces. But the infrastructure around the industry is so solid in Los Angeles, New York, and London. We're talking props, talent. I mean, if I'm shooting with talent and I tell them they've got to fly to for argument's sake, they got to fly to Prague, they're probably figuring out how to fly home every weekend, and that's not conducive to a supportive environment. Los Angeles, London, and New York will always remain the epicenter, at least in my view, of film and streaming production. It's not to say that it won't go elsewhere and grow, but everything's built in place to support those systems. It's very hard to move away from that.
Tima, thanks for spending a couple minutes with us to talk about this subject. It's fascinating.
I really enjoy it. I love this stuff. I love building it too. I want to be honest. I love architecture, and this typology is so exciting because there's so many things you have to figure out, and they seem minuscule. I mean, a stage is essentially a windowless box, but there's so many avenues you have to understand and prepare for and analyze in order to get it all right. Because again, it's a factory. These places need to function impeccably, or else you basically have production delays, which those can amount to millions and millions of dollars and are unacceptable in our field.
Thanks to our audience for joining us as well. This is John Caulfield from Building Design and Construction.